This is John Drabinski, and you're listening to the Black Studies Podcast, a Mellon Grant-sponsored series of conversations examining the history of the field. Our conversations engage with a wide range of activists and scholars, senior figures in the field, late doctoral students, and everyone in between, culture workers and political organizers, in order to explore the cultural and political meaning of Black Studies as an area of inquiry and its critical methods. Today's conversation is with Melissa Daniels-Rauterkus, who teaches in the Department of English at the University of Southern California. She has written extensively on African American literature and cultural studies and is the author of Afro-Realism and the Romances of Race, Rethinking Blackness in the African American Novel, published in 2020 and designated as honorable mention for the MLA William Sanders Scarborough Prize. In this conversation, we discuss the place of literary studies in the Black Studies imagination, the relationship between cultural production and everyday Black life, and the politics of Black study inside and outside the academy. Hello, Melissa. Welcome to the Black Studies Podcast. How are you doing?
Hello, I'm doing pretty good.
Well, I'm really happy that we have time. You made time to talk about your work, about the field of Black studies, all of these sorts of questions that are part of the series. I really love your book. You and I did a books podcast. I'll link to it in the text that goes along with this, which was, for me, not only was it a fantastic book, but it was one of the most thoughtful and interesting conversations I had on that books podcast. And so the chance to talk with you about this kind of thing again, right, to talk about your ideas, your work, your imaginations of Black literature, culture in the field, it's a real treat for me. So I really extra appreciate your time and your thoughtfulness today.
Oh my goodness, that is so incredible. Thank you so much for that. That's like the best thing anyone's ever said to me.
Well, it's true. You had an award-winning book. It was, it's publicly acknowledged as such. But, your book raised, and we'll get into this, but it just raised so many questions that I think are really also at the heart of Black studies. You're a literary scholar first, but just really hits at the center of Black studies. And I know your new work is going in different directions, but also taking on so many of the things that this field of Black studies really needs more and more work on. So, but before we get to sort of how you imagine Black studies, Black study, and your work in relation to it, I wanted to start really with a personal question and just ask you to narrate for us a bit how you came to be interested in the study of Black life. What drew you to Black studies, to the study of Black life, and what sustained you in relation to it?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think that growing up in a mixed race family, my mother's family, they're from Louisiana. And so I kind of grew up with an awareness of racial mixture, hybridity. I have a white stepfather. I have half siblings who are mixed. And so I was always just very interested in race as an identity category, as historical and social formation, but also in terms of like how we identify. I was a very sensitive kid, and I felt a lot of things that I couldn't even really begin to comprehend on any serious intellectual level, but I was very much aware of race, and I was very much aware of my Blackness, and I was aware because I grew up poor and on welfare and in Section 8 housing, and so I knew as a kid that my Blackness was a part of how I was experiencing the social world, and I wanted to understand that. I also grew up incredibly proud of my Blackness. I grew up in the late 80s. I was a teenager in the 90s, and it was cool to be Black.
Yeah.
It was cool to be Black. We had this amazing artistic and musical tradition. And it was actually my love of books and Black literature that really kind of brought me to Black studies.
Yeah, I should add, you grew up in Los Angeles. There's sort of an emerging group of LA-born people guests on this podcast. So at some point we may have to do a follow-up podcast with the LA Origins folks.
Oh, I would love that.
Yeah,
I would love that. That's cool.
And I think there's something really interesting about, you mentioned, that being in the 80s or in the 90s, there was something cool about being Black. I mean, it reminds me, and I'm just really happy to be able to say his name out loud always. My late former colleague, Jeff Ferguson, who talked about growing up, this was in the 70s, and he was like, everything I read about history, we, meaning Black people, we were the good guys. We were the superheroes. Like, who wouldn't want to be on this team? And it was the same sort of thing, grew up very hard, Scrabble, struggling, lots of, personal struggles and difficulties. But there was something really abiding about, what you call cool. And he was saying heroes, that's something really important about that affective dimension that, can come alongside reading books, or can also be, what gets you to those books.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. I would agree with that.
So thinking about the sort of draw to Black studies, how do you think about the field? And I asked this, how do you imagine it? How does it function in your imagination? And, maybe in that way as a kind of guide to the things you think about and write about and teach and talk about. And I ask this in the context of its origin story, right? That it has that origin in late 60s, early 70s Black liberation struggle, which was really reconfiguring in such important ways the relationship between communities and higher education, what the classroom, what liberation struggle and its politics looked like. And that was a real different kind of imperative, right? That it was about Black studies as an intervention in political struggles for liberation. But there was also alongside that the need for educational systems to represent the Black intellectual tradition, which in the disciplines at the time had so little, if any, representation. And so, that had an imperative about developing, expanding, appreciating, et cetera, the intellectual tradition. And really at its birth, I think Black studies has this tension built into it between political imperatives of liberation and intellectual imperatives of developing an appreciation of ideas, texts, and expressive culture. So when you think about Black studies, how do you think about it in relation to this origin story? Because we are 50-something years after that moment.
Yeah, that's such a great question. And it's a question that I think about a great deal. I started my career at the University of Alabama at Birmingham, and this is a place that has a very storied history with regard to civil rights and the Black Studies movement. And actually, when I started there, they were celebrating 50 years since the seminal events of the civil rights movement. And I was teaching an Intro to Black Studies course. And so I thought a lot about the origins of Black Studies. And it really gave me occasion to kind of chart the distance between that moment and the moment in which I was starting out on the tenure track. Yeah. And so for me, I imagine that origin story as really a history of change. As you said, in its early days, Black Studies was mostly concerned with creating a viable ecosystem for the study of Black people's history and culture. What was so transformative to me and kind of radical about that moment is that students and professors and community activists were able to come together and reform the institution and its relation to the public, with an understanding that scholarly activities should address political problems and benefit Black people. Since then, I think Black Studies has evolved to become a transdisciplinary enterprise. It exists as its own discrete entity, but it also encompasses and transcends multiple disciplines within the social sciences and the humanities and the natural and physical sciences. And, at many affluent institutions, Black Studies enjoys departmental status and is sustained by research centers and, postdoctoral fellowships, graduate students. When I was in grad school in the mid-2000s, that was a really exciting time to be in grad school and to be kind of learning about the field formation of Black Studies. Because at that time that I was at Northwestern in the mid-2000s, scholars working in Black Studies, they were challenging the field's frameworks, and they were innovating, and they were pushing the boundaries of Black Studies field formation. And, I studied with people like Dwight McBride and E. Patrick Johnson and Sharon P. Holland. And, at that time, they were confronting the field's homophobia and creating the then emergent field of Black queer studies. And Black performance theory, was this new mode of inquiry that kind of gave us a language for thinking about theatricality and the production of Black subjectivity. So, coming up during this time, it seemed to me that what it meant to work in Black Studies was to be on the cutting edge of academic research. I think Black Studies was very conscious of its intellectual and expressive tradition and was really committed to its evolution. Mm-hmm. I also think, though, at this time, the objectives were more organized around, traditional academic goals like creating tenure track lines at elite R1 institutions and creating fellowship opportunities, publishing scholarly monographs with prestigious university presses. I think what it means to work in Black Studies now has changed a great deal since I was in grad school and since I took my first job back in 2013, and even since I came to USC in 2017. I think that our political environment has significantly deteriorated. And
sure.
yeah, I mean, and in the wake of SCOTUS's decision to end affirmative action in higher ed last year and the subsequent dismantling of DEI, I think that the Black Studies Project is in peril. And I think we're in a really dire moment that will require us to go back to our roots and to fight for our right to exist. And I think in this kind of political climate, we really need to balance activism and community engagement with the pursuit of scholarly innovation and institutional support.
And there's something really interesting. This has come up in a number of the podcasts, both for myself and for Ashley, who's my collaborator, of even just this question of how, on the one hand, as you said, I think there really was that phase, and you were right there at Northwestern for it, perfect sort of scenario, right? Because of their program really exploding in terms of national significance, and I have some very amazing alums and all of that. In that moment of really expanding the level, the scope of intellectual inquiry. And that seemed to me to almost be this moment. It's maybe in the moment in which I'm even asking this question, like being out of touch with our contemporary, because at that moment you could really see a split, as you were saying, between this institutionalization of Black studies and a sort of second level, book series at, presses that will get you tenure and, fellowships and visiting professorships and all of these sorts of things, grant possibilities. And that really emphasized in some ways that original struggle between the sort of bookish people and the activist people, right?
Yeah.
The political community people.
Totally.
And, and a criticism that somebody like Manning Marable had of Henry Louis Gates and their famous in some circles, those of us who teach dispatches from the Ebony Tower regularly, very critical of this idea of, intellectual pursuit as, the criticism being it's too apolitical. It is weird for me to be asking that question in 2024 with each week, I have to say.
Yeah.
As some states, I'm here in Maryland, you're in California. We don't have an immediate peril in terms of what we teach. But when I talk to somebody in Florida, when I talk to somebody in Texas, all of a sudden this idea that your intellectual pursuit is somehow not political enough, it's like, well, tell that to the state legislature.
Exactly.
But also tell that to us in a Republican presidency in 6 months. We all need backup plans if we're in Black studies. And I'm laughing to keep from crying because I have a little financial panic when I say that. I got bills to pay. So.
Yeah. Tell me about it.
But it really does create this question of, have we gone back to that origin story again in terms of like even the intellectual idea of an intellectual tradition is itself deeply political in ways that I hadn't anticipated.
Yeah.
I don't know what we do except hope. Hope that this question becomes more stark and intellectual work becomes less political. So that we could at least have that argument inside Black studies, but also that remembering that ideas are a form of activism in some ways.
Absolutely. I kind of think that to go back to these two camps that you identified, even in 2005 when I started my PhD program, I was kind of aware of the two different camps, and what that looked like in the profession. You had the kind of like the Black cultural studies faction, and then you had, that older generation, they were activists. Their idea of a Black studies project was very much invested in creating pride, and Black racial solidarity. And, I think that, the cultural studies camp, they were invested in post-structuralism, in theory and MLA. And then, that older generation, they're like the CLA people.
Yeah.
And I don't know. Maybe we need to come together and have, a more integrated, holistic approach to Black studies in this moment. Just a thought.
C/MLA. No, I agree with you. That slash, right? And that imaginary acronym is, there's a lot of work to be done there, because I do have to say that I do think that original generation that saw like the politics in every act of Black studies, I don't think they laugh about this, but if they wanted to, they could be having some last laughs.
Oh, for sure. For sure.
Reminder that this is political from the beginning.
From the get-go.
Well, let me ask, sort of return to your question of your work and how you imagine it. You're deeply invested in literary studies, and your first book is a wonderful exercise in literary theory and literary history and analysis. And I know that your current work is leaning into the autobiographical and literary engagement, cultural studies. And so I'm interested in sort of this work in cultural formation, that's both historical and contemporary, and that you're doing. how you see this in relation to the history of the field of Black studies, but also what horizons do you think it opens up that are new and innovative?
Yeah, I like this question. You know, I kind of came to literary studies through the door of literary history. And I'm someone who's just naturally really interested in ancestral genealogy. And I'm very aware of my elders and the foundations that they laid and the contributions that they made. And so for me, I think there are advantages and disadvantages to learning about African American literature and in kind of engaging the Black Studies project from within an English department, and then, getting that training in an Africana Studies or a Black Studies department, right? But because I was trained in the English department, I imagine African American literary studies as a very crucial arm of the Black Studies project, going all the way back to, its Black Power, Black Arts Movement days. I think about Jean Andrew Jarrett, who I think has done some wonderful writing about that particular moment. And, Jean has written that during this time, activists and critics, they approached Black literature as an imprimatur of Black politics, meaning that the literature had to be by us, for us, and about us. It had to emphasize Black self-determination, racial solidarity. It had to be about overcoming racial oppression. In some ways, you could say that this kind of reduced the literature to sociology or reflecting the material conditions of Black life. But it was certainly true of that moment that Black literature was doing a lot of the work of making the justification for Black studies. I think this changed in the late 1970s when, people like Robert Steptoe and Skip Gates were moving away from that militant kind of cultural nationalist approach to Black literature and calling for more theoretical studies, more formal studies of the literature. At the forefront of this shift, you've got there's this really important generational shift that happens at that moment. Farah Jasmine Griffin has written about this. She's called this group of scholars the Norton generation. Because it's great.
I know it's probably meant a little bit derisive, but I actually really love that.
I like that term too. These are the people who edited that first Norton Anthology of African American Literature. So, we're talking about Gates, obviously, Nellie McKay, Bill Andrews, Houston Baker, Barbara Christian, Frances Smith Foster, Deborah McDowell, Hortense Spillers, Richard Yarborough. These were my heroes, they did the literary history, right? They did that important work of recovery and reappraisal. And that was really crucial to establishing a canon and defining an African-American literary tradition. And, they seriously took up post-structuralism. They applied it to Black literature, and they created an African-American literary studies that was about theory and cultural studies. And, as I said earlier, I see myself as kind of that third generation, right? So that second generation after the Norton generation would be the people who trained me at Northwestern, Dwight, E. Patrick, Sharon, Alex Wahalia. They further developed the field. And I think that, their contributions are mostly that they introduced questions of gender and sexuality, class, and Black ontology to Black studies. My work, I think, builds on this history. I think I'm always implicitly thinking about the past of Black studies and how our interpretive practices are serving us or not, moving our fields forward or not, and adding to the complexity and diversity of Blackness and Black experience. Part of what my new book explores is evolution, is change. I'm interested in how African American literature has migrated to the cultural sphere. And in my opinion, its most compelling expression is now the adaptation to the big screen, or the limited scripted series on Amazon, Netflix, or Hulu. And I think a lot of, the most insightful criticism, it's no longer happening, in Callaloo or New Literary History, it's happening on Threads and X. And so, I want to know, in light of these changes, why haven't we adopted more dynamic accounts of what constitutes Black literature? Why haven't we adopted more public-facing criticism? Well, and no disrespect to the theory heads, I believe I'm more
offense.
I'm
theorist. I take no offense.
Yeah, no disrespect there. I'm more of a methodology, literary history person, but I think that, method is theory in some ways. But I do wonder, why do we assume that intellectual rigor always means theory? I'm going to practice Black literary studies that reads the Hood ghetto novel alongside the seminal documents of the Civil Rights Movement. I want to do scholarship that affirms who I am as a Black woman, and that has an audience beyond the academy.
Mm-hmm. No, that's super interesting. Thank you for that response. This is so much to think about and talk about. I have to remember other people than me are listening. That's going to spark a lot of conversations, because I think that opens up, a lot of questions about that a novel is a medium, right? And so if you talk about media studies, the medium of expressive culture is also, I've never seen limited scripted series as a form of cultural and literary analysis. But that's strange, as you say, because there's so much happening in these moments.
There's a lot happening. We're seeing the adaptations of, Colson Whitehead's The Underground Railroad, right? Zakiya Harris's The Other Black Girl on Hulu. There's something that's happening, the adaptation of Kindred, which is kind of loosely based on Octavia Butler's, book of the same name. But I feel like a lot of the criticism in literary studies, it's very negative. It's very apocalyptic. It's very much, people don't read anymore, or, the role of the critic, has been erased. And I just don't think it's true. I think that we do still read. We read differently. And I think that we do, we do perform criticism, and we do the work of the critic. It's just that the critic is no longer, the persona of a Harold Bloom.
Yeah.
Criticism has been democratized because it's happening on social media.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, thinking about those arenas of critical work beyond, sort of social media as judgy, right? And instead as doing intellectual work. But I'm especially interested, not especially, but also, there's something really potent there about the origins of Black studies when you say, reading, not just reading the seminal classics, but also reading, I forget your phrase, was
the Hood novel.
The Hood novel.
Yeah, I just finished rereading, where is it? I just finished rereading Sister Souljah's The Coldest Winter Ever, which came out in 1999. That was the year I graduated high school. And it created a firestorm. I mean, it was amazing. And it was so rooted in, 1990s Black popular culture and hip hop and fashion and in, street culture. Mm-hmm. And this was a book that was a New York Times bestseller. I think it's crazy it hasn't been adapted, to the big screen yet. But books like The Coldest Winter Ever, or even, Terry McMillan's Waiting to Exhale, clearly indicate that Black people read, and that literary culture hasn't truly gone away,
And I think that word people, right, when you say Black people, there's something really interesting about the origins of Black studies, that the political dimension of that was so much about the liberation of ordinary or everyday folks, right? And it's to think that in a literary context, like what does it mean to do literary studies, Black studies committed to these principles, and raise that question of the people in Black people, right? Rather than the classics, but it's coming out in just a couple of days. I mean, it'll have been in the past once people hear this, but, my conversation with Mark Anthony Neal, I mean, he had a lot of thoughts on this in terms of the study of popular music. It's like, this is actually where scholarship and regular folks have a relationship.
Yeah.
That is actually one of the imperatives of Black studies from the beginning. And so it's interesting you say, like, why, this is sort of your innovation, like one of your innovations as a teacher and scholar. But how is that, it's interesting that you could even talk about that as an innovation in a field that was dedicated from the beginning to the study and appreciation, engagement with everyday folks.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we have to ask the question, whom does Black studies serve at this point? Yeah. There's clearly a disconnect between the privileged, tenured Black studies scholars in the academy and just regular everyday Black folk.
Yeah. And that maybe, community engagement is not the only model. Maybe it's also what we study and what we write about and how we write about it. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, I couldn't agree more.
So, this is very much related, I think. But, you've already talked about your intellectual journey, at Northwestern in an English department, but also engaged with the African-American studies folks there. And it's a great list of names you had. I was like, I wish I had a doctoral list of names quite like that. So a fantastic group of people you had a chance to study with. But you did disciplinary training. You're in an English department now. But so much of what you work on and so much of how you talk about the texts you talk about in your publications are cultural studies deep inside the tradition of Black studies. And I'm sort of interested in how that relationship between an area studies, that Black studies sensibility and disciplinary training, how that relationship guides you, right? Whether it's opening up new horizons or even constricting you at times in terms of your scholarship, but also your classroom.
I really like this question. I think in many ways, like this is an innovation and a contribution that I think is really unique to literary studies. But I think that literary studies has been enriched by the idea that literature as a sphere of signification includes non-literary works like letters and speeches and essays, as well as what we call cultural production, art, music, film, TV, theater. I think that, this is an insight that has mostly been attributed to literary theory, but I think that African-American literary studies has been particularly adept at showing us the literariness of non-literary phenomena and explaining how literariness enhances both our understanding of lived experience and the significance of cultural objects and practices. For me, a great example of what this looks like is the Norton Anthology of African American Literature. And not that I think that it's the, authoritative, definitive take on the African American literary canon, but it is certainly one
But
of
it is something we give to all of our students at some point.
Exactly. Exactly. And so, if you look at the Norton, its rendering of the African American literary tradition is grounded in a broader vernacular tradition that includes Negro spirituals and gospel and the blues and work songs and jazz and rap and, sermons and folk tales. And, the Norton features non-literary works like speeches and essays, George Schuyler's Negro Art Hokum, and and this is all integrated into the anthology. And so because this is how I was trained to think of the African American literary tradition, I kind of can't help but to think about that larger cultural sphere that literature exists within and how that sphere is also a part of a literary work's DNA, so to speak. Yeah. And so, this has been really good for my scholarship because, I'm at an institution and I'm in an English department that is extremely creative. And we've got great synergy between our critical track and our creative writing track. And the kind of scholarship that my colleagues do is one where we just kind of assume that the category of literature includes all these other things. I am not in a department where I would ever have to worry about, someone voting on my promotion and saying, well, this isn't literary studies. Like that would that would never happen in my department. And so, again, getting back to my new work, it's been great. Now that I'm tenured, I feel like I can really stretch out and be me. I just finished this essay on the New Jack Swing and African American literary studies for Cambridge UP's forthcoming volume, African American Literature in Transition. And this is they're devoted to particular decades in African American literary and cultural history. Great series. And this is the one for the 90s. And this is my decade. Like I was a teenager in the 90s. And, in this essay, I'm really stressing how commercialization transformed Black aesthetics, the cultural sphere, and the academy. And, I talk about how Terry McMillan gave us a new model of popular authorship where books spawn lucrative soundtracks and movies, and, how Skip Gates testified on behalf of the rap group Two Live Crew during their obscenity trial. I try to imagine being in the courtroom and Skip Gates is defending Two Live Crew's allegedly pornographic lyrics, on the grounds that they possess literary and cultural value and are rooted in, the African American rhetorical practice of signifying. It's wild. I don't know if that would happen today, but I think it's cool.
It is an astonishing moment. It's kind of, I can't believe it happened, but it did. I remember when it happened.
Yeah. So the literary, it includes all of these things, and I think that some of the new anthologies really get at this well. I have Shirley Moody Turner and LaValerie King's contemporary African American literature anthology, and it opens up with this very idea that the literature includes, all these other things.
Yeah. And it's interesting asking this question in this podcast to people in disciplines. And it strikes me as a kind of a funky question for English faculty, because in some ways English departments and just the practice of literary studies, especially especially people working in Black literature, have almost become area studies. Because as you say, the Norton itself, which is a foundation piece, and, I do delight in giving that to the few students I've given it to and say, you need to know this anthology. And they're like, it's very long. But then the eclecticism of it.
Yeah.
It almost is like an area studies text rather than a disciplinary text. And I say that as someone whose early career was in philosophy departments, where this idea of it being anywhere near departure from what a proper philosophical text is, that's a huge argument to have. That's like a career is going to be made trying to argue that there isn't a thing called a philosophical text that we all agree on and everything else is not philosophy. And this idea of Black literary practices having from their very origins this diffuse and diverse and dispersed, set of sensibilities and ways of presenting texts. It almost makes Black literary studies and Black studies indistinguishable. While at the same time, I think like what you're getting at when you want to use a word like the literariness of non-literary objects, that's where that disciplinary language is helpful.
Yeah.
But it kind of is already kind of starting from an area of studies. So that's more me talking to myself about asking this question to English people.
Yeah, no, I think I love how you put that. That's really interesting.
That's also me enjoying now being joint appointed in an English department rather than a philosophy department. No shade, well, a little bit of shade at my past employers. So let me ask a sort of big speculative question. When you think about the field of Black studies, what do you think that it has done particularly well historically? But what do you think it hasn't done particularly well?
You are so good at putting together these really thoughtful questions. And, this question, I'm almost kind of scared to kind of answer the second part of the question. But I'm going to be brave and take it on.
You're tenured.
Yeah, exactly. So let me start with the positives, right? I think we've touched upon this already, but I think that Black studies has been really good at institutionalization within the university. In the early days, students, scholars, activists, they did the work. They pushed for Black faculty, curricular change. They established cultural centers. And in the years after, they really fortified the field's institutional presence through the production of influential scholarship and by way of institutional support for research. Intellectually speaking, I think that Black studies has done a really good job of centering concepts like resistance and exploring questions of being and subjectivity. When I was in grad school, these were the dominant lenses through which we learned about anything. I mean, these were the dominant lenses through which I learned about slavery and Black life. I mean, I went to grad school at a time where everyone was talking about Stephanie M.H. Camp's, book on everyday resistance. And, we would take up the question, why do we always have to be resisting? And it was a really generative question, but that's to say that resistance was a very crucial heuristic. And I think that studies of being, Black ontology, and so I think that Black studies has done a great job of really creating an intellectual discourse for those kinds of ideas. I think, now this is like personally, I think that Black studies is at its best when it's challenging narratives of victimization, authentic Blackness, whatever the hell that is, monolithic Blackness, social death, Black studies, to me, is at its best when it's focusing on how Black people exercise agency, experience pleasure, and engage in world making. What I don't think that Black studies, at least the literary studies arm of it, has done well is resonate with Black communities outside of academia. And I don't want to be too hard on Black studies. I don't think that this is a failing that is unique to Black studies. I think that it's just characteristic of academia and academic scholarship in general. To me, what good is an insular Black studies that, this is going to sound a little shady, but I'm going to say it anyway. What good is an insular Black studies that only serves the career advancement of privileged scholars, fluent in esoteric critical theories? I know I sound like Joyce A. Joyce. I don't know if you remember that the debate in New Literary History between Joyce A. Joyce and Skip Gates and Houston Baker. But, what good is a Black studies that's just about career advancement or, navel gazing? We need to be invested in what's happening to Black people outside of the university. And I think in a climate where federal support for Black studies may very well disappear, especially in public institutions, what future can Black studies have without broader financial support? How many of us are really writing for a non-academic audience? I think that we don't have a future if we can't articulate our relevance and our utility outside of higher ed. Because, the university is itself in crisis.
We're not alone. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because sort of what I forget exactly how you phrase it, but in terms of my question, like what has Black studies not done so well and what Black studies has done well? I mean, in some ways, these two are holding hands, right? Institutionalizing itself so that there are jobs, so that there is a curriculum, so there is a place that if you want to study Black life without, your 2 weeks of like Black philosophers or Black history, right? You actually just study that on its own, Black life on its own terms. That's been a success, but the study part is always a question, where does that have meaning and where does that connect and disconnect to other practices of study and of readership, I like that asking a question, and the part of the way you characterize it, I don't think you meant it. Maybe you did, in which case there's a brawler in me that has a lot of respect for it. But you named my own, orientations, and so many of our orientations about, the internal debates of critical theory. But it's that animating part of like, well, where does this reconnect to ordinary people's lives, and what does it mean to ask that question of Black studies? It's really complicated, but it ought to be complicated and hard and unnerving. I never like that thing where it's like, you're asking this hard question that sort of puts everything at stake. Maybe dial it back. Let's put everything at stake. If we're in crisis as the university, as Black studies, as look, even the desire for equality is in crisis in 2024. If we can't ask ourselves into uncomfortable spaces, I mean, what's the fucking point, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that Black studies is something that makes the university better. I think that without Black studies, the university can't truly carry out, its purported mission. Without Black studies, the university is not a space to pursue social justice, racial justice, equity. And so I think that the success of Black studies is really tied to the success of the institution. And I think that Black studies has value for everyone. Everyone is made better by Black studies.
Well, there will be, by the time yours is out, this, and it's coming out tomorrow. What is that? September something, 17th. Nathaniel Normant, who's one of the original figures in the field of Black studies. I think he puts it really well in this podcast, where he says there is no more expansive, relevant, for everyone field than Black studies. And for me, in some ways, that harkens back to my own. Now we're talking about my own bookshelf in teaching, but Nathan Huggins' Black Odyssey, where he tells the story of the Odyssey of Black people in the United States, and he's like, so what I've told you here is a story of the United States, right? That's national history, but it's flipped it on its head, right? We're a tyrannical nation under the guise of freedom. And so, that has to be a question for everybody. And it certainly is a question of if universities have some relationship to responsible citizenship and citizenries. Absolutely. I think universities know that. And I think we as institutions need to start playing that card harder.
I think I couldn't agree more. It's a missed opportunity. I think that a lot of the time, we've attached the, we've kind of allowed ourselves to kind of been co-opted into these arguments about the humanities. And maybe we shouldn't do that. Maybe we need to kind of detach ourselves from the arguments in favor of the humanities and really kind of make a transdisciplinary argument for the universal appeal and necessity of Black studies.
Yeah. So let me ask you a futurist question. We've been talking about the past and the contemporary crisis. Let me ask a sort of futurist question, speculative question about what do you think would be the sort of indicator or index of the ultimate success of Black studies as an endeavor? Because if part of the impulse for Black studies is, original impulse for Black studies is because the disciplines had failed to study Black life in any kind of coherent and comprehensive way. Is the success of Black studies to have so transformed the disciplines that you really don't need Black studies, right? Is that what because we're certainly doing that. I think English departments are unimaginable without Black studies today. Same with history departments for sure.
Yeah.
Or is the ultimate success of Black studies to emerge as something with its own methodologies, its own critical frames that actually disciplines themselves could never digest and absorb?
Yeah, definitely the latter for me. I mean, I think, honestly, where would traditional academic disciplines like English and history, and maybe you could even open it up to law, certain areas of law anyway. Where would these disciplines be without Black studies and the lexicon that Black studies has given other disciplines for thinking about subjectivity, for thinking about agency, right? For thinking about the failures of democracy. I mean, Black studies is its own intellectual and expressive tradition with its own methodologies. I think that there was probably a moment when maybe we thought that the success of the project would, bring about its obsolescence, but I don't think so. I recognize that we're at a moment when identity-based scholarship is under attack. But in my opinion, I think we've been doing away with the identity-based components of the Black Studies Project for a long time, long before the dismantling of affirmative action and DEI. I think we needed to go beyond identitarian frameworks to really explore Blackness in all its complexity. And institutionally speaking, we needed to do away with identity to obtain full academic legitimacy and to get material taught in places that couldn't recruit Black scholars for whatever reason. Again, I see Black studies as a field with its own methodologies. And I really think that these methodologies transcend identity. Now, that's not to say that universities are off the hook when it comes to hiring and promoting and retaining faculty of color. I still believe that we should, balance disciplinary expansion with a commitment to diversifying the faculty, right? It is important to have Black professors teaching Black studies, but I also think that there's certainly room and space for non-Black people who have the training to do the work. So that's kind of
that's
my
where the
answer.
methodology question gets really interesting. We have a lot of anthologies of Black studies texts, of classic works in Black studies. But I think the thing to be written is that question of Black studies methodologies. So obviously it'd be plural. I mean, every discipline has plural methodologies. But I think backing up and thinking about what is a Black studies methodology, I mean, Ashley and I are going to move the podcast eventually into some separate podcasts about, particular themes. And that's one question for me, like, just what is a Black studies methodology? I find it totally fascinating. But I also find it fascinating that I couldn't say, well, let's go look at this book. Here's a collection of a range of methodologies and the debates around them. But maybe that's part of, a 50-year number as a kind of round number, event kind of based number. Maybe it's the occasion for that.
Yeah. I that's fascinating to me. As a person who thinks a great deal about methodology, what does that look like?
Yeah.
I'm not sure I have the answer to, what constitutes a Black studies methodology.
That's why it makes for such an interesting conversation, because I think a lot of us are like, wait, how would I articulate that? That's where ideas happen, though, right? In those open spaces. And if the future of Black studies is to be its own thing, always, eventually we have to have those debates and disputes, and it's academia, so there'll be lots of petty takedowns. But I believe in a little bit of brawling over the nature of what. How we do things produces stuff. Well, let me ask you as a final question. And this is just, let's put the field in your hands for a moment and ask, what do you think for Black studies, what do you think is the question we should be asking or the problem we should all be thinking about?
So I want to go back to something you said earlier about liberation, and that kind of got the wheels turning in my head, because I really think that for so many years, Black studies has been about liberation, and I think that we've secured many victories on this front, but Black people are still fighting for bodily autonomy and self-determination. They're still fighting to stay out of prison, not get killed by the racist police officer, So, we have to kind of continue to pursue liberation in those terms. But I also think that in today's academic climate, we need to think about what institutional liberation would look like. What would it look like for Black studies to not be so dependent on the university? And I like to call it tenure and promotion schemes.
Yeah, that's a great phrase. Yeah.
What would it look like for Black studies to be more public facing and to be doing its own philanthropy and fundraising campaigns? I'm married to a business school professor, and so I've kind of over the years have picked up some of his terminology. And I was asking him the other day, I was like, you know what? Academic publishing is so broken and there's a lot wrong with it, right? But like, what would it look like to create a vertically integrated publishing model where practitioners, we as practitioners of Black Studies, were controlling the production, the publication, and the dissemination of Black Studies scholarship, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that would kind of circumnavigate some of the problems, that are in the publishing model that we have that make it difficult for our scholarship, to be published and to reach readers. There are only so many university presses with Black Studies lists. There are only so many people who have the institutional status and the time to read manuscripts, right, and do peer review. It's certainly not a level playing field either.
Not at all.
And I think we have to ask ourselves these kinds of questions if we're really serious about ensuring the discipline's future.
And man, some of the original texts and some of the greatest texts that we teach in Black literary studies and Black studies, if you go find the original versions before they're anthologized in the collected writings, are stapled, right? Some of my most prized possessions are, Amiri Baraka and Sonia Sanchez early poetry collections, which were published by this group of Black arts people, right? And they're literally, they're not from Kinko's because it's pre-Kinko's, but they essentially printed these things out, folded them, and they sold them at poetry readings. And obviously that's on this scarcity model, presses not wanting to publish this kind of stuff and so forth. It has its own problems. But I love this idea of like, what would it mean, especially in the 21st century, where what it means to go get something published is a whole different endeavor. You can make books in Word, and to think about that model, I love that. That's liberating Black Studies from the institution. Everybody talks about how Black Studies is compromised by institutionalizations, but I think you're the first person to say, what are our strategies for liberating it from that institutionalization, right? Because we all want jobs, but also the scam of tenure promotion. And what it means to get published at that or this academic press it has so many contingencies that, don't even get me started on that.
We need to move to a publishing model where the scholarship that we generate is self-directed, that it's happening organically, that we have the time and space as scholars to take up a project and really take the time to kind of develop that project and to write and rewrite. And that takes time. And our current system does not really allow for that. Like our scholarship is not self-directed. It's other-directed. It's driven by the institution. The institution is telling us how to work, and the institution is assigning the value to our work. And that just seems really wrong-headed to me.
I love this. This is a great place to wrap up. That's really provocative. You and I should talk separately about maybe putting this in motion. I love this. Right? It really, this the manifold meanings of liberation and really sitting with that at the level of writing. It's why so many of us got into this. I love that. So
absolutely. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for your time. As you know, Melissa, I really loved your book. I really love your work. I really believe in it. I think it's so interesting and innovative. So I was really excited to sit and talk with you. And this is really so much of what I was hoping for and more than I was really expecting. So I appreciate your time, but I really appreciate your thinking and your creativity and your challenges that you put to everybody listening and to both of us as we sit here talking. So thank you for your time and for making space for this podcast in your daily schedule.
Thank you, John. It's always a pleasure. Thank you so much.
All right. Well, take care and have a good rest of your day.
You too. I'll be in
Bye-bye.
touch. Bye-bye.